On the side mirror of my ute, there's a statement on the mirror that says, "Objects may appear to be larger or different than they actually are." You know, that's not just true when I'm driving and looking in my mirror, but sometimes in life, things can look very different depending on your perspective. I know for me, I oftentimes fall into this trap. Because I believe that God is the author of all of life, I can fall into the trap of thinking that when things are good in life, then God must be being good to me. And the opposite of that is true. When things are not going so well, I can sometimes think to myself, well, perhaps God is not being good to me. By the end of this video, I want to introduce you to our third and final bad boy of Easter that is going to help us to understand that just because things aren't going well in life doesn't mean that God is not being good to us. In fact, we can even find God's goodness in life when things are going bad, as our character in the story is going to tell us today. But before we get to all of that, let me quickly recap where we've been so far in this series. The first two bad boys of Easter that we talked about, one was named Caiaphas. He was a guy that struggled with controlling everything in life so that he could preserve the lifestyle that he had set up and all the benefits and the perks that he benefited from it. Jesus was a threat to that lifestyle, and that's why he eventually plotted to have Jesus crucified. We also met Judas. Judas was a guy that tried to bargain with God, wanted to set up things so that if he did this, then God would provide this in his life. Both of these people really struggled with control and trying to leverage God for their own benefit. Today, we're going to see a different person, another character that winds up finding out that the real freedom in a relationship with God and the real freedom in life is found through an idea called surrender. Now, we don't know a lot about our character today. In fact, we don't even know the character's name. But we know this much. He must have made a decision at some point in his life that sent him down a wrong path. Not only was he a criminal, but he was such a bad criminal that the Romans had sentenced him to be executed. And not just any execution, he was sentenced to be crucified, which meant one thing. The crimes that he had committed, probably many of them, were so violent and so horrific that he had to be executed on a cross. See, most Roman criminals would have been sold into slavery, or they would have been assigned to a Roman boat to be down in the galley, the underbelly of the boat, rowing their life away. But this criminal was so violent, his crimes were so horrific, that the Romans decided to crucify him, not just to eliminate his life. Crucifixion wasn't just about killing someone. Crucifixion was about humiliation and sending a message to the public that whatever that criminal had done, they should never attempt to do that, because they were visualizing what would happen to them, and the end of their story would be a horrible, horrible death. That's what crucifixion was all about. It was sending a message, and it was humiliating the criminal. So you can only imagine this particular criminal probably was thinking about his life and fell into the same trap that you and I oftentimes do. When life is not going well, then God must not be present. Or when things in life are going bad, then maybe God is not good after all. You've probably had those thoughts. I know I certainly have. But as we'll see in today's story of this criminal on the cross, one of two, either side of Jesus when he was crucified, he chose a different mindset. And it's a mindset that I think many of us can learn from today. Now, this criminal had every reason to be able to fall into the trap of saying, when life isn't good, then God must not be good. He was at the pit of his life in a Roman prison about to be executed. But instead of falling into that trap, he chose, as we'll see in today's story, to run towards God for mercy, grace, and refuge. I've seen this so many times play out in my own life when others around me have had a bad deck of cards dealt to them in life. Instead of blaming God, they run towards God. Maybe it was a health diagnosis that they received. And instead of saying, well, God, my health is no longer good, That means you must not be good. They chose to run to God for mercy. Some people have had horrible financial dealings. Maybe it was a business deal that went south and they lost everything, but they chose to run to God instead of blaming Him. For some, it's broken relationships. They have a child that's so wayward, they think it's impossible for that child to ever come back and begin following Jesus again. Instead of blaming God and saying, well, life's no longer good, God must not be good, they choose to run towards God for His mercy and His grace. What about you? Have you begun, when life is not good, to start saying, well, then God must not be good? Or do you run to God when life is not good for His mercy and His grace? The doctor in the first century named Luke, he took detailed accounts of all the eyewitnesses who had seen Jesus' life and His death, and he recorded all of these accounts for us in a book that was named after him, the book of Luke, or the Gospel of Luke. In this account of Jesus' life and also His death, as we'll see today, we're going to discover the difference between two criminals either side of Jesus when their life is at its worst, how they responded, and we can learn to do the same thing as we look at these stories today. In Luke chapter 23, we read these words: "Two other men, both criminals, were also led out with Jesus to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified them there, along with these criminals, one on his right and the other on his left." Now, listen to the words that Jesus says as He's being crucified. The pain and the agony that Jesus is going through, and all of the ridicule that we're about to read in this story, Jesus says these words: "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Unbelievable. With everything that's going on, all the pain and suffering that Jesus is going through on my behalf and on your behalf, the first thing that comes to His mind is to pray for forgiveness for those that were dealing with Him the way they were, because they didn't know what they were doing. Luke goes on to say this: "And they divided up His clothes," Jesus' clothes, "and they began casting lots." Essentially, they took the clothes that they had ripped off of Jesus, and they took the fabric and they began to bet on it so that they could make money off of it. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at Jesus, meaning they mocked Jesus. The people that were in charge of the crucifixion, the religious leaders, the Roman rulers, they all began mocking Jesus. Not only were they mocking Jesus, but Luke goes on to tell us another group of people mocked Him as well. Here's what some of them said: "He saved others," speaking of Jesus, "let Him save Himself, if He's God's Messiah, the chosen one." In other words, if He's the Messiah, then why can't He save Himself? He was able to save other people. He raised Lazarus from the dead. Why can't He save Himself? Luke records for us that the soldiers also began to mock Him. They came up and they offered Him wine vinegar, it says, and they said this: "If you are the King of the Jews, then save yourself." They were referring to the sign that was hanging above Jesus' head that Pilate, the Roman officer, said must hang above His head, that said, "Jesus, King of the Jews." The religious leaders wanted it to say that He claimed to be the King of the Jews, but Pilate wanted to send a message to anyone that would claim to be a king and threaten the Roman rule and threaten the Caesar. He wanted everyone to know this is what would happen to them. Not only did the soldiers make fun of Him, not only did the rulers and the crowds mock Him, but then it says this: one of the criminals who hung next to Him on a cross began to hurl insults at Him as well. He asked Him this question: "Aren't you the Messiah? If you are, then save yourself and save us as well." But then we read the account that Luke gives of the other criminal and what he did. It says this: "But the other criminal rebuked that criminal who was mocking him and said, 'Don't you fear God? Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence as this man? But we are being punished justly. He said, this man is getting something he doesn't deserve. The criminal next to Jesus says to the one insulting Jesus, we are being crucified and we are being sentenced justly because we're getting what we deserve. But he goes on to say, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then the criminal said to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And then those famous words of Jesus' response to the criminal who didn't say, my life is horrible, therefore God must be horrible. Instead, he ran to God when his life was a mess, hanging there on the cross with no expectation of God being able to do anything for him in this life. He wasn't bargaining with God saying, if you get me down off this cross, then I'll live the rest of my life for you. He wasn't trying to control the situation or preserve his life. He knew that his life was over. And in that moment, he ran to God for mercy and refuge. He asked, remember me when you go into your kingdom. And Jesus' famous response to the man, the criminal on the cross next to him, he said this, today you'll be with me in paradise. So let me ask you, which one of the criminals, either side of Jesus, do you relate to the most right now in your life? I mean, I know that you're probably not hurling insults at God right now, but have you fallen into the trap of thinking, because some area of my life is not going well, then God must not be good to me? Is there an area of your life that you can identify that's not going well? And how are you responding to that area? Are you running to God for mercy to find refuge in him? Or are you choosing to fall into that trap of blaming God for whatever it is that's not going well in your life? These two criminals give us a great perspective, a great visual response to how we respond when things in life are not going well. Imagine the difference it would make in your life and in my life if we chose to respond the way the criminal on the cross who wasn't insulting God, who wasn't insulting Jesus, responded. Imagine if when life is at its worst, when life is toughest, whether it's financially or relationally, or maybe with your physical health or some other aspect of your life that isn't going well right now, imagine the difference it would make. Instead of equating life not going well with God doesn't love me or isn't good to me, imagine running to God for mercy and refuge in those moments. Imagine the difference that could make in your life. As we looked at these three bad boys of Easter, we see a common theme. Each one of them had a choice to make. The first two chose not to surrender their life to God. The final bad boy of Easter chose in that final moment of his life to surrender all of his life to God. We see the difference that it made in his life compared to the first two bad boys of Easter. They lost everything because they couldn't surrender their life to God. He gained everything when Jesus said to him, today you'll be with me in paradise. So how about you? Is there an area of your life that you need to surrender to God? Imagine the difference it will make in your life when you choose to surrender to a God who loves you, cares about you, and ultimately a God that you can trust your life with.